Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Saqib Bhatti, and I'll be moderating the call today. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, so please hang on the line. Your line is currently muted, and we'll talk to you soon. Folks will be starting in just a couple minutes. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Saqib Bhatti, and I'm the co-executive director of the Action Center on Race and the Economy and ACRE Institute. It's amazing to be gathering here via Zoom with a group of powerful leaders as we partner with Bargaining for the Common Good to launch the Cancel Wall Street campaign. A robust social safety net is essential to the health and vitality of our communities. The COVID-19 pandemic has confirmed what we already knew, that we need to dramatically expand and fully fund public services like healthcare, education, and utilities like water, heat, electricity, and broadband internet access. Unfortunately, state and local government officials from across the country are preparing to unleash devastating cuts in light of the decline in tax revenues that the pandemic has caused. Shredding the social safety net to balance the budget will leave our communities more vulnerable to future waves of COVID-19 and the public health and climate crises to come. We know the same Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities that have already borne the brunt of the casualties from the COVID-19 pandemic will also be forced to bear the brunt of the cuts that will be caused by COVID-induced austerity. This is wrong and will only worsen the ongoing crisis. Instead of forcing our communities to bear the brunt of the costs, it's time for Wall Street banks and investors that have been profiting from our cities to pay up. In the report we're releasing today, which you can find at cancelwallstreet.org, we're calling on the Federal Reserve to offer long-term loans to all state and local governments, school districts, and public agencies without charging any interest or fees. This will allow our governments to refinance all their existing debt and cancel $161 billion in interest payments that they make every single year. That's billion with a B. It will also allow them to invest in new infrastructure to make our communities stronger. The way we currently finance our governments does not make sense. Even though municipal borrowers have a default rate of just 0.16%, they're forced to pay $1 in interest for every dollar that they borrow. Furthermore, cities with higher concentrations of people of color are forced to pay even more. That is outrageous and is not right. Wall Street banks and credit rating agencies have written the rules of municipal finance to protect their profits. We need to rewrite the rules to protect our communities. Banks already make money by discriminating against us, foreclosing on us, nickeling and diming us with fees, investing in private prisons to lock us up, financing fossil fuel infrastructure that's polluting our communities, and selling us other predatory products. They shouldn't be able to profit from redlining our state and local governments too. That's why we're excited to launch the Cancel Wall Street campaign today. But make no mistake, while this $161 billion will go a long way towards transforming our municipal finance system in the long haul, we know that it's not enough. In order for our communities to rebuild and thrive, we also need to raise progressive revenue, which means raising taxes on the billionaires and mega corporations who have made windfall profits during the pandemic. And it also means demanding that the federal government provide direct aid to our communities in the form of grants. On this call, we'll hear from elected officials at the federal, state, and local levels, grassroots leaders, expert academics, and labor leaders from across the country about the challenges they're up against and why they're ready to stand together to reclaim $161 billion in interest from Wall Street and invest those funds into necessary services and infrastructure in their communities. The elected officials on the call are also joining together to launch a sign-on letter calling on Fed Chair Jerome Powell to take action to help our struggling communities. In just a couple of days, we already have almost 20 elected officials signed on from Congress, state legislatures, county commissions, and city councils from places like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The speakers on this call will also share with you that members of the city councils in both Chicago and Los Angeles are intend to introduce resolutions in support of this campaign at their next meetings. We plan to wrap up by the top of the hours. Your lines are muted, but as we move to questions, we'll be able to unmute them. If you have any questions that you're not able to ask here or you want to get in touch with a particular speaker, please follow up with Megaphone PR or email us at media@acrecampaigns.org, and our communications team will follow up with you. You can also find our report and online tool at cancelwallstreet.org. And just so you know, we are recording this call to share with people who weren't able to join us. So with all the housekeeping out of the way, we have an exciting lineup of speakers today. Before we have our live remarks, we're happy to have a video recorded message from Congressman Chuy Garcia of Chicago, who wanted to be here in person but was unable to join us. Tia, could you please play the video from Congressman Garcia?
I'm Chuy Garcia, and I'm proud to represent the 4th District of Illinois in Congress. Good afternoon to everyone, especially my fellow Chicagoans, and thank you for joining us for this important fight. I don't need to tell you that state and local governments need support right now. I represent a working class immigrant community. The last recession hit us hard. We talk all the time about the financial collapse, but we don't talk enough about the austerity that came after the Great Recession. Chicago closed dozens of schools and cut funding for community centers and libraries. All over the country, as state and local governments cut their budgets, the recovery stopped and unemployment got worse. Our suffering was predictable. It was a political choice. Austerity is a choice. We know that our state and local governments are hurting. We know that the Black and brown communities like mine suffer most when schools, libraries, and clinics are closed. So I'm proud to join you today and call on the Federal Reserve to give state and local governments the financing they need, because in the richest country on earth, austerity is a choice. And I join our partners in Chicago and across the country to say no more cuts. Thank you.
Great. So next we'll hear from Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez, Alderwoman for Chicago's 33rd Ward. Alderwoman Rodriguez is a powerful ally and will be a powerful advocate in helping us launch this campaign. Rosana?
Thank you, Saki. Thank you for inviting me today. I want to say first that I am really hopeful about this gathering. I am really excited about the possibility of being able to have this voice together to make sure that we're getting the desperate need the desperate help that we need for our communities, our state and city governments. As everybody knows, Chicago is going to be in a hole this next budget. We are facing probably a $2 billion budget fall. That is going, if we are not able to get the revenue that we need, it is austerity. There is nothing else for our communities. The issue with austerity is that we have been under austerity. We don't have anything else to cut. When we live in austerity, people die. When we live in austerity, people don't have access to the services that they need. When we live in austerity, people are displaced. Under COVID, our situation has gotten so much worse. Unemployment is rampant. And in Chicago, we are facing a huge wave of violence that is killing our children. More than 20 children have been killed in Chicago because of gun violence. And we know that this has to do with concentrated poverty that is going to continue to rise because we don't have the funding and the support services that our communities need. So we cannot allow for this to continue to happen. We cannot be in need when we know that the resources are there in the Federal Reserve. So I am here to add my voice to the choir here to demand that the Federal Reserve issues zero interest loans, zero cost long-term loans for states and municipalities. Chicago definitely needs this money in order to be able to save lives. What we're talking about right now is life or death. We need this money. I also wanted to say that I will be one of the electeds that is going to be introducing a resolution in our next city council that takes place on October 7. A resolution to call for the Federal Reserve to issue those zero interest loans. And I really hope that we are able to continue to get more people on board. We need more electeds on board. We need more organizations on board because we need to have a unified voice. We cannot stand any more austerities. Our community cannot stand any more austerity. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Alderwoman Rodriguez. Really appreciate you, and I'm so grateful for your fighting with us in this struggle. Next, I'd like to introduce Stacy Davis-Cates, the Vice President of the Chicago Teachers Union and the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and a member of the Bargaining for the Common Good Advisory Committee.
Thank you for having me today. Look, the bottom line is we are in a moment of tremendous struggle. We're in a moment where the president of our country doesn't pay taxes and shifts the burden of this country onto the backs of those who have already built this country up. Working families, Black people, our immigrant communities. That being said, our politicians, our elected officials are going to put forth a series of false choices in the coming days, weeks, months, and years that will tell us that they cannot function. The function of government will have to be narrow and more marginal for those who need it the most. And then those people are also going to be taxed with the prospect of keeping it afloat. It doesn't have to be that way. If we identify austerity as a tool of racism and sexism that narrows the ability of people of color and women to have a lifestyle that is both humane and safe, then we're saying that the Fed needs to do better. We're also in this deep discussion nationwide about our children returning to school buildings that are ill-equipped to keep them safe. There is a way for us to get the funds necessary to make our ventilation systems work better. There is a system necessary, there's a way to create a benefit in the communities where our students live, where their parents work, to make this better. Look, the choices that are being presented: push children back into schools that are unsafe because the economy needs it. That's not a choice, that's an ultimatum. What we are presenting here today is a path forward, a vision for the lives of people who need it the most, where the government, instead of putting the burden on them, provides them with the infrastructure, the support, and the investment to actually lead a quality life. The work in this moment is, number one, to reject these false choices. Number two, to prioritize the lives of people that Americans have decided in this moment are important. If we can lament, if we can grieve, and we can mourn, and we can put in headlines the loss of Black lives, then what we can do in this moment as well is invest in those lives. And the government has a responsibility. The Federal Reserve has a responsibility. So what we're saying here today is to fund our schools. It's to fund the neighborhoods in which our public schools are anchored, and to reject the false choice that austerity, which is racist and sexist, is the pathway forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. That was great. So this is a national campaign, and we're very excited to have partners on the call today from across the nation, including the South, where this fight is so important. Our next speaker is Odessa, the Executive Director of Standup Nashville, the leading powerful grassroots campaign in Tennessee against corporate power that perpetuates economic and social inequity born from entrenched systemic racism. Odessa?
Hey, hello everybody. So I appreciate you inviting me to be on this along with ACRE and everyone else that's here on the call. What can I say? Nashville is no different from any other cities that you just heard about in Chicago and what you're gonna hear. I mean, let's keep this simple. People are hurting. People have died. People continue to die. And we literally have a system that is built to capitalize off of that misery. That is technically what we have in place. What more needs to be said? Wall Street has two very clear choices of what it can do. It can either stay the course, allow cities to struggle, have these austerity budgets. And for those of you who don't know what austerity means, that means bare bone minimum, what is needed. And whenever it's bare bone, Black people, Black and brown people, all marginalized communities get the brunt of that. So let's be very clear. So just in case you don't know what austerity is, austerity equals bad. So with that said, they can allow cities to continue to struggle and they can stay rich. Or they can give relief, be a part of the movement as we try to change and put hope and trust back into people, into the systems that we have, and also stay rich. Because it's not like they're gonna lose money either way. We're talking about the top 1-2% of the world right now. So it's either, that's the issue that we have. We really have to start talking about this in a more simple way and getting at the crux of what it is, right? So we have systems that are made to work, right? And so a lot of times people don't get involved and think, oh, that's their problem. No, but when something is made to break, it's not gonna stop once it breaks a certain thing. It's gonna keep breaking. And eventually it's gonna hit you where you sleep, where your comfort is, and where you live, and where you lay your head at night. So we have to come together as people who are really gonna change this. Out of that 161 billion that Saki was talking about earlier, for Nashville, which is where I live, 158 is where our city will recoup. That is literally saving whole departments down here for people. Whole departments. We're talking about people who have families, who have pensions, all these, we're talking about city employees. Go to work.
Odessa, I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt you. I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you all of a sudden.
Nothing but the devil. Can y'all hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. All right.
We can hear you, Odessa, but it's a little bit faint. It's growing more faint than it was.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Still pretty dim. We can just listen closely.
Is this better?
Yes, that's much better. Perfect. I was like, I knew something just needed to sort out. Okay, start again from how much Nashville stands to be supported by this campaign.
Gotcha. So Nashville would be about 158 million that Nashville would recoup. That is literally saving whole departments. That is what would happen here. We're talking about families, children, all these people who depend on having this money, right? This is their livelihood. Nashville got 121 million alone in the CARES Act money. We were able to stand up Nashville to get 15 million of it to go directly to the household needs for mortgage and rent payments, right? Out of $121 million. Like, where is the rest of that money going? Well, that's the same ethos and that's the same train of thought that we need to have and what Wall Street could easily fix. This is something that's not just happening specifically to one community, it's happening across the country. And it's gonna take us to look beyond our geographic lines and understand that this is a class issue, which is always going to be a race issue. And we have to come together and have an honest conversation about how we fix this.
Thanks, Odessa. That's really powerful. This is, as you said, this is a racial justice fight, and you really sort of made clear like what's at stake here. So we're going to continue with our next speaker, a powerful advocate for human rights and very experienced in the fight for investment in infrastructure and public services. Naira Sharif, Director of Flint Rising in Michigan.
Hello. The Flint water crisis is a case study of what happens when the needs of bondholders and Wall Street supplant the public health and well-being of people. This started with the need to sign the city of Flint, then under state receivership, to a municipal bond deal to finance the Kirigani Water Authority, or KWA. The city of Flint was a critical partner because the municipality had the largest customer base in the proposed service area. This $400 million deal, of which Flint was on the hook for $100 million, was later named Midwest Deal of the Year by the Bond Buyer, a municipal finance website. The KWA received an award at a ceremony at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel in December 2014. While the KWA was receiving this posh award, Flint residents had already gone through 3 boil water advisories due to E. coli, discolored and smelly water, and were soon to receive notice of a Safe Drinking Water Act violation due to total trihalomethanes, or TTHMs. Lead was soon to follow. As I organized my neighbors to go and speak to local elected officials and appointed officials at the state level, the message was clear. We weren't going back to a safe source of drinking water because the city was on the hook for the KWA bond deal and other previous bond debt. We were a sacrifice community that was too Black and too poor to deserve clean water. Our water rates rose to the highest combined water and sewer rates in the country to pay off bondholders. If we had federal investment in our infrastructure, local municipalities would not have to fall prey to these schemes. We wouldn't have regressive fees and taxation where families are having their water turned off, losing their homes, or having their families broken up because of municipal bond debt. Flint is still broken, and it is estimated to cost over $1 billion to replace our water mains and sewer lines. 18 months of cutting corners aged our water lines by over 20 years. If we had progressive revenue streams, Flint could finally be ADA compliant and install sidewalk curb cuts in all residential neighborhoods, or replacing water and sewer lines so we can reduce biological pathogens in our drinking water. Or our schools could be fully funded and lead poisoned children could have the special education resources they desperately need. We need to cancel Wall Street so we can have what we need in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naira. Really a deep appreciation for all the work you do and the ways this fight is just not about public budgets, but the human impacts of corporate power in our public services. That was just really, really compelling. So moving over to the West Coast, we're very glad to be joined we're very glad to have Laura Raymond joining us. Laura is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Community Transit in Los Angeles. Laura?
Yeah, greetings everyone. Greetings from Los Angeles. My name is Laura Raymond. I'm with ACT LA. Our coalition of 38 member organizations is fighting for a complete transformation of how LA County approaches housing and transportation. I'm also here representing the Healthy LA Coalition, which is a brand new coalition we formed during the pandemic. It's 330 faith organizations, faith communities, unions, small businesses that have united to propose concrete solutions to the very real hardships facing our communities. And I'm happy to say that this morning, as part of this campaign by ACRE and Bargaining for the Common Good, as well as work by our local Healthy LA Coalition, our LA City Council members Bob Blumenfield, Mike Bonin, and Marquise Harris Dawson introduced a motion that the City of LA would formally support this ask to the Federal Reserve Bank to change its loan terms. The motion also instructs our CAO to enter into conversations with financial institutions that serve as bond underwriters to push them to offer no fee, no interest 30-year loans. The motion will go to our budget committee and then will be considered by our full council. I personally was astounded to learn that the City of LA would save $1.1 billion if the Federal Reserve and lending institutions do the right thing. LA desperately needs this money. We, pre-COVID, had the worst homelessness crisis in the country. We have 56,000 people without homes in LA County, living on the streets, living in their cars. You know, we've got, due to structural racism, we've got some of the worst inequality in the country. We've got the Hollywood Hills towering over growing homeless encampments. We have about 60% of renters here in LA rent burden. That means they're paying 30% or more of their income on rent. And our communities and our coalitions, we've come together. We have bold solutions. We have bold ideas for a just transition. We do not want to go back to pre-COVID. For us, there's no going back. Normal was already a crisis. And so we've got proposals. We want social housing in the City of LA, and we actually passed a motion in the City of LA on social housing. We also have an idea to acquire at-risk affordable housing and transition into land trusts that our City Council is considering. We want to provide assets and infrastructure to street vendors who are a very large entrepreneurial movement in our city, providing delicious food and really important part of our street culture, but right now can't work. We've got an idea around local PPP loans for small businesses to support people who are thinking about closing their businesses due to the pandemic. And I also wanted to talk about what's going on with our public transit system. If the Federal Reserve and lending institutions do the right thing, LA Metro could save $195 million. And public transit here in Los Angeles, it really is about getting our essential workers to work right now. The LA County bus rider median income is about $17,000 a year. 86% of bus riders are people of color, and specifically Black people and immigrants depend on the transit system. Right now, essential workers are depending on our transit system, but bus riders are routinely waiting 30 or 45 minutes or longer for buses. Just last week, Metro approved a budget that had 20% bus cuts in it, despite some lines already being crowded and unsafe, and really being our essential workers who are depending on the system right now. But Metro is paying $195 million in interest payments to Wall Street. It's also paying $800 million over 5 years on policing transit riders. So we believe that this money could go to better bus service, fare-free transit, and community alternatives to safety, such as outreach workers and transit ambassadors, programs that will actually create safety on the system and provide a high-quality service that bus riders deserve. So we're fighting to transform our transit system, but we need this money back from Wall Street. So I'll just close by saying that we have bold solutions for a just recovery. We are already facing austerity in LA. We need our local governments to step up and make sure that we can recover in a way that centers workers, renters, and transit riders, but we need revenue to do this. So we absolutely need the federal government to step up. We're in full support of this campaign, and I just wanted to thank everyone for being here and for working on this important movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for sharing the work you all are doing and that exciting update about the City Council resolution. Next, we're excited to hear from Alfonso Mayfield, President of the Florida Public Services Union at Seiu.
Thank you all for having me. The pandemic is showing just how much we depend on each other. No matter who we are, where we're from, or the color of our skin. Suddenly, people providing services, including the thousands of educators and campus personnel at community colleges across Florida, who are keeping our schools running. They are front and center because more and more people are realizing just how essential their work is to our recovery. Community college faculty are going to work every day to ensure people who lost their jobs during the pandemic are getting a shot at a new career. Now more than ever, we're seeing the opportunity for affordable higher education as a critical public service for thousands of Floridians who are out of work. Community college faculty are providing instruction at institutions that are relatively inexpensive when compared to four-year institutions. Educators are logging in online to ensure the system's students, who are overwhelmingly Black and brown, have a shot at quality higher education that they would not otherwise have. Fundamentally, what these educators provide is opportunity. These educators are also making it possible for students to stay at home where it's safe rather than traveling long distances, which is especially important in a pandemic. Florida families are getting education services they need that will see them through this crisis and beyond, but that can all be taken away because there's a looming crisis on the horizon. The state budget outlook is dire in Florida. Economists forecast an overall state budget deficit of $5.4 billion over the next 2 years. I'm gonna say that again, $5.4 billion over the next 2 years. Cuts to essential services like education are likely. I'm particularly concerned with how cuts are going to impact Black and brown students who are primarily served by our state's community colleges and the educators who give them a leg up. In 2018, 58% of the students going to school in Florida college system were people of color. Some schools have much higher percentages of people of color. 83% of students at Broward College and 71% of students at Valencia College. System-wide, 45% of the staff are people of color. We can't cut our way out of this crisis. We all know that. We need to adopt the reforms that Council Wall Street suggests. These reforms could save the entire state of Florida alone $892 million. Miami-Dade could save $663 million. With the $892 million in savings, Florida could double the pay of every adjunct faculty member and fully fund a year tuition and fees for every first-time, full-time college student. It's time the Federal Reserve stepped up. It's an all-hands-on-deck moment, and we need every institution to make decisions that improve the lives of the working families struggling to stay afloat in this crisis. That means the Federal Reserve must offer state and localities interest-free loans so our students and educators can thrive. The truth is that even in the midst of a deadly pandemic, our community college system could be serving more students and providing stable employment to hundreds more educators. The savings that Council Wall Street suggests could address a substantial portion of Florida's budget holes while allowing our state to invest in our community's needs. It's time to prioritize Florida's communities over Wall Street. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfonso. Next, we're gonna hear from our delegation from New York. So we next welcome Bob Hockett, Edward Cornell Professor of Law at Cornell Law School and a regular visiting professor of finance at the Georgetown McDonough School of Business. Bob also used to work at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This campaign is about reshaping fiscal policy in favor of our cities, and there's no one better to speak about that than Bob.
Hey guys, thanks so much for letting me be part of this, and thanks all of you for coming. So I'm actually talking to you from Wall Street right now, believe it or not, which is probably a little bit shocking. It would probably be more shocking to the people here if they knew who I was and what I was doing. In any event, the reason I actually live here is because I used to work at the New York Fed, and so I'm going to talk to you sort of in that capacity as somebody who used to be there and who still does a lot of his sort of legislative drafting and policy design work sort of in light of what I know about the central bank of the United States. So three really basic, simple things I want to get across. The first is that, as you guys know, we're faced with a national crisis in the form of this pandemic, and normally there would have been a national response. Normally there would have been federal agencies working to address this pandemic. They would have been the first line of defense, or at least they would have been the second line of defense right after the frontline communities and the states. As we all know, that's just not the case right now. We don't seem to have a federal government. We don't seem to have any federal instrumentalities that are compos mentis. We don't even have a White House that is coherent or compos mentis. The entire crisis seems to be nothing but a self-promotional opportunity for the current inhabitant of the White House. And what that means for all of us right now is that our cities and states are de facto federal instrumentalities in addition to being what they already were. That's to say that they're not just our communities and our states right now, they are our federal agencies. Now, normally we federally fund federal agencies. And insofar then as states and cities are functioning as federal agencies, they should be federally funded too. Note furthermore that when we fund federal agencies, we don't lend to them, and we certainly don't lend to them at market rates with penalty rates added atop of those market rates. We federally fund them. We don't federally lend to them. So insofar as states and cities are now our federal agencies, they shouldn't have to borrow from the federal government either, and they certainly shouldn't have to borrow at quote unquote market rates or with penalty rates on top of those. That's the first point. Second point, the Federal Reserve System is called the system for a reason. When the Fed system was first founded over 100 years ago in 1913, in order to get congressional buy-in from across the country for a central bank in the US, assurances had to be written into the Federal Reserve Act itself to ensure that it would function as a system of local and regional development banks, not simply one great big bank for the banks on Wall Street. The concern in 1913 and in the lead up to 1913 was precisely that a central bank would become a bank for the banks in the Northeast. They were worried that it would be New York dominated or Boston dominated or Philadelphia dominated or all three dominated. And the only way to get Congress to sign on to a central bank was to say there's going to be a Federal Reserve System. There's going to be a whole set of Federal Reserve regional banks. That's why we have a Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, a Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and so on. These Federal Reserve banks, there are 12 regional Fed banks, are meant to be local and regional development institutions. They weren't meant to function as a gigantic liquidity sinkhole for Wall Street banking institutions. Maybe the New York Fed was meant to deal mainly with the New York banks, but the San Francisco Fed, the Dallas Fed, the Kansas City Fed, the Minneapolis Fed, the Atlanta Fed, all of these Feds were meant to assist local business and local communities with development, ongoing, forever national development. That's what the Fed system was meant to be. It's obviously not functioning that way these days, and indeed it hasn't for a long time. So that's the second point. Third point, third and final point, we have the opportunity now to restore the Fed to that original mission of, again, a system or a network of local and regional development bank institutions to facilitate the development of small business and of community development across the country. We have that opportunity through two potentially game-changing programs that the Fed has put into place in April, but that have been effectively commandeered right now by bond trading people as ever. I'm referring, of course, in part to the Municipal Liquidity Facility established or announced on April 9th, and to the so-called Main Street Lending Program, which is a set of 3 or 4 facilities, depending on how we count them, that are all meant to help with local business. So I'm going to call this the Municipal Liquidity Facility and the Main Street Lending Facilities. Now, if these programs were functioning as they're meant to function, they would be run out of all of the different regional Fed banks. The San Francisco Fed would be running these programs out in the West. The Dallas Fed would be running them in the Southwest. The Atlanta Fed would be running them in the Southeast, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, they would not include market rates. They certainly would include penalty rates. The language of market rates and penalty rates is a language that's left over from 2008 when the bailouts were for too big to fail banks. And sure, it made sense 12 years ago when you're bailing out a bank that got itself into trouble by excessively risky behavior. Sure, do impose a penalty. That's essentially like a deductible or a coinsurance on an insurance payout. It makes sense because there is indeed indeed a moral hazard problem if you're talking about big banking institutions in Washington, in New York. But we're not talking about that here. Nobody can say that there's a moral hazard problem. The cities and states did not bring on this pandemic. The cities and states are not responsible for the existence of somebody who is completely non-compos mentis and sociopathic in the White House. And there's no reason to think that if we assist our cities and states in the way that they need, that they're somehow going to bring on a new pandemic after that because they got off easy this time, or that they're going to bring back another Nazi into the White House because they got off easy this time. So we have to do away completely with all of this market rate nonsense and all of this penalty rate nonsense and treat these facilities as they were meant to be, which is as forms of federal funding for cities and states that are acting as de facto federal instrumentalities. If we weren't simply running them out of New York and Boston, as we're doing right now, the entirety of the municipal municipal liquidity facility is being run out of the New York Fed, one block away from where I'm talking to you right now, and the entirety of the Main Street lending program is being run out of the Boston Fed right up 95 for me a few hours. It's ridiculous to think, isn't it, that the New York Fed is going to understand all of the needs of Oahu and Hawaii, or is going to understand the needs of Billings, Montana. They're wonderful people who work there at the New York Fed, at least the rank and file folk I used to work with. But it's not fair to expect them to understand all of the local needs across the country. Similarly with the people up at the Boston Fed, a lot of lovely, wonderful, hardworking, sincere public servants working up there, in the rank and file at least. But it's ridiculous to think that they know the needs of Ned's Nails in Watts, or the needs of Tanya's tractor repair in Fargo, North Dakota. We shouldn't be putting that on those feds alone. These programs should be run out of all of the feds, and that's why I've been pushing a slogan of late, just spread the Fed, spread the Fed. That would simply return the Fed to its original mission as, again, a sequence of, or a system of local development banking institutions that we need now more than ever, given that all of our cities and states, again, are functioning as our de facto federal government in pandemic response right now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Professor Hockett. Just really, really important information. Also from New York, we have another one of our elected allies, Assemblyman Ron Kim.
Thank you, Saqib and ACRE and the ACRE family for hosting this, and all the allies across the country. My name's Ron Kim. I represent District 40, Queens in New York. I've been in office since 2013. I made some news a couple of years ago as the first elected to stand against Amazon HQ2. Not only stand against it, but I was the first one to call on a full antitrust investigation to break up Amazon a few years ago. For decades, our political leaders allowed markets to take over our government by creating tax rates and codes that made the rich richer, even during economic meltdowns like the ones that we're seeing today. By expanding, redefining, and protecting capital gains for the rich, the ultra rich continue to make profits by managing and governing inequality in our most vulnerable communities. Through strategic marketing and help from pop culture and corporate media, Wall Street has convinced the world that they are better at governing and at public management. You know, that's why politicians for years had no problem convincing the public that borrowing from Wall Street, private capital, and private investors is a win-win for us, because Wall Street is filled with the smartest and brightest Ivy Leaguers, no offense, Professor Hockett, trained to maximize, productivity and profits. I don't think I need to convince anyone, including Professor Hockett, who I teach a class at Cornell with, that in this phone call, that's the biggest sham of the 21st century. Wall Street is good at taking advantage of financial opportunities. They're good at extracting as much wealth, profit, and value from our most vulnerable communities. And at the core of this extraction is interest-bearing loans and private debt the muni bond market, the credit market, and private investors are doing everything possible to not just normalize austerity, but embrace austerity so they can leverage their private money. And they'll do whatever they can and hire as many lobbyists and consultants and leverage every relationship they have to make sure that we do not seek a public option, which is what Professor Hockett has been focused on for so many months, if not years, of establishing. At minimum, I think Wall Street should cancel the $161 billion in interest, and they should not just cancel it, but thank us for us not demanding them to pay back the hundreds of billions of interest they collected for the last 30 years. You know, I will be introducing a similar resolution when we go back to session, and I would talk to our counterparts in New York City Council to look at the resolution as well. We already have legislation around MLF, but we are also looking at new legislation to possibly mandate moving forward that our authorities only look at liaising with the Federal Reserve and exploring borrowing from the Federal Reserve instead of private money in moving forward during emergencies like these. I look forward to working together with this ally, with the allies in this phone call, and learning more about how we can work together moving forward.
Thanks so much for your leadership in the fight to rein in corporate power, Assemblyman Kim. The Bargain for the Common Good framework is really about labor and community partnering together. So next we'll hear from Henry Garrido, president of AFSCME District Council 37, which represents New York City workers. Henry is also on the Bargain for the Common Good Advisory Committee. Henry?
Hello, everybody. I'm Henry Garrido. I'm the executive director of District Council 37 here in New York. I represent 150,000 city workers and about 100,000 retirees who depend on the benefit, and their families, totaling about 387,000 people that we cover for. I want to talk to you about what the power of 48 hours at this point is, because, you know, the events like this are so critical to keeping the pressure on for what is happening in this country. 48 hours before, 22,000 city workers were slated to be laid off tomorrow. That's as a result of the austerity that they're now launching for the city's financial crisis. So the city is in, you know, deep economic recession as a result of COVID-19, the projected revenue loss, and obviously the lack of economic, you know, activity. The city's projected $9.3 billion loss for the next 2 years, as well as the state up in the 30s. So not only is the city expected to lose, but it's also expected to get their funding reduced from the state of New York. And, you know, as a result of it, the city council, the mayor passed a budget which had a hole of $1 billion that had to be resolved by October 1st, generally by concessions of labor unions representing city workers, which are about 400,000 people. Folks, I've seen this movie before. In 2001, when September 11 happened, city workers who were running towards the hole, the pit, trying to save lives, were touted as heroes after sacrificing the lives and the well-being, only to be confronted by layoffs a couple of months later by the city of New York to the tune of 20,000 city workers. At that time, we begged, steal, did everything we could to try to protect those workers. We still lost workers consecutively for 10 straight years after that, but they raised taxes, they found a way to generate revenue. And of course, the biggest piece of that is the then mayor of the city of New York, Rudy Giuliani, was allowed to borrow billions of dollars from Wall Street to be able to keep the city functioning. Moving forward, 2012, yet another crisis, right? Superstorm Sandy comes in and dumps billions of gallons of water here in New York City. City workers, again, come in, step up, municipal workers to save, removing, you know, the trees, saving people from being drowning, driving people to work on an emergency basis. 236 people died at that time, and New York City workers, municipal workers, many of them whose families were affected, had to put their family second to go and save the rest of the public. Moving forward now, here comes the COVID pandemic. And as you know, New York City was the epicenter of this pandemic early on in the United States. 151 of my members died. Let me say that again. 151 of my members were deemed essential from day one, who could not stay home, died. I had over 3,000 people who were sick, and most of them were in emergency rooms and critical conditions, and some of them are still in that situation right now and have had to retire or go into disability retirement as a result of it. What is the reward? Well, first, public relations account for elected officials, many present company excluded, to talk about how much of heroes they were. Great, the heroes of New York. They saved us, essential workers, frontline, respiratory therapists, nurses, were recognized, doctors, great, but also people who were doing everyday function, cooks and cleaners and custodians who were doing incredible stuff and sacrificing their own well-being, the well-being of their families. City workers sleeping in cots, sleeping in the cars so that they can service 12, 14, 15-hour day to the public at a time where the public hospitals and the system in healthcare was just on the brink of collapse. And great, the numbers begin to get better. Pandemic numbers begin to, subside. And yet again, the heroes of New York. And they want to call me and want to have a plaque, and they want to have a recognition of and ceremony. And we do all of that stuff. And we hear incredible stories of people who sacrifice, entire families who had done. One such stories I'll never forget. A city worker who was a respiratory therapist whose entire family died. And she came into the hospital system, and it turns out she had the antibody. So the possibility of her coming to work every day and coming home, and then her family was not immune, did not, ring a halo on all of us who were trying to assist her. Only to hear that 3 weeks later, she was on a layoff list to be laid off. That was the reward for her sacrifice. That is morally reprehensible. And here we are, right? As a potential solution, we talked about, again, borrowing. The mayor of the city of New York has suggested he wanted to borrow $7 billion from, and needed a state authority to do that. And so people agreed or disagreed and figure out that there may be other alternatives for us to do something that is not austerity, and we should not be bailed out by borrowing from Wall Street. We should do a millionaire's tax in New York, the ultra millionaire's tax, who was abandoned by the state legislature in April when the state budget was done. But the likelihood of that happening did not happen in enough time to be able to save the layoffs. So in the last 24 hours, we managed to get an agreement from the city of New York not to lay off those 22,000. How do we do it? We borrow from our funds, folks. We were able to take some of the borrowing authority that we have because we cover so much of the lives to be able to withhold the payments from the city to those workers. Raises, things that were done to them are being put on hold and being deferred in order to just save them enough to get past this election. You know, it is some of the most grueling negotiations that I've had, with the hope that the state legislature comes back and does an early retirement incentive that allows people to leave, you know, in a humane way. We're not out of the woods at all, but I was happy to hold a meeting today with my members, telling them that that's where we were heading. We, in the process of doing that, did everything possible to get to the Federal Reserve to allow the city to borrow money. And what I found was not only appalling, but was, I think, offensive because of a number of things. So number one, city workers here have about $292 billion of pension money invested in Wall Street. The state workers, which I have state workers too, have another $400 billion plus. Together, we have about $600+ billion invested in Wall Street. And if you look across the country, public sector employees across the country have more than $10 trillion invested into Wall Street. You know, I sit on the National Union as an executive vice president for ACME, and I talk to all my colleagues across the nation, and they have the same issue. If you add some of the Social Security, there's another $10 trillion in there. And yet somehow we are the first one to be asked to pay. So as an institutional investors, if you will, I went to the Federal Reserve here in New York and I say, hey, listen, if we lose 22,000 people, not only are you losing contributors to that pension, which are funding your Wall Street activities, you're losing all the economic activities that they produce, purchasing power, right? All the ability to buy a home, the ability to keep paying the rent and to buy local businesses. You don't want that in the economy. Since your number one loss here in New York is personal income tax going down because we have 1.3 million people unemployed, you want to make an investment. And at the time, the federal was offering a great 1.9% increase interest loan to the city to be paid within 24 months. How generous was that of them? Which we could do not only better, we could do twice better, if you will, with the outside market. And so we rejected the idea. That was their offer. Then they called us after intervention with some of the lead Democrats here in New York and said, okay, I'll tell you what, we'll do this better. We'll offer you 36 months instead of 24. You have to pay this in 36 months with penalty, and we'll agree to delay the payment. We'll lower it by 0.30%. Well, folks, I could do better in the regular market with this. This is outrageous. And I'm just going to close with this, right? City workers, essential workers, municipal workers who have been framed as a hero should not be bearing the brunt of the economic consequences. They've sacrificed enough. They pay with it with their own lives and the lives of their families. This is a disgrace. So it's time for Wall Street to step up, but it's time for the federal government to do the right thing for those workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. It's just unconscionable that the essential workers who risk their lives and make tremendous sacrifice for our communities who are facing layoffs, just atrocious. But congrats on stopping the layoffs, and there's a long way ahead, but that's just an important milestone. Thank you to all of our esteemed speakers. I'll turn it over to Tia also now to facilitate Q&A with the press. Because we have, we're as part of our launch of the campaign today, we're excited to be joined with many community allies from across the country. You can find our report and the campaign toolkit at cancelwallstreet.org. Because we're short on time, we have an organizing call planned for our community partners for a couple of weeks from now that we'll follow up with you about. But in the meantime, I'll turn it over to Tia to lead us with Q&A.
Thank you, Saqib. So if there's any members of the press that are still with us on the call that would like to ask a question of the panel, you can just raise your hand. There's like a small button at the bottom right that says raise hand, or also there's a button that says unmute. And so you can raise your hand and indicate if you'd like to ask a question, and we can have you get your microphone live and ask a question. It doesn't look like we have any, which is okay because we are at the hour. Last call. All right, back over to you, Saqib.
All right, thanks, Tia. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. The Cancel Wall Street campaign launches today with our website, cancelwallstreet.org. Again, you can go there to find a copy of the report and your online calculator, as well as a campaign toolkit to see how much money your state and local governments could save, and to find a copy of sample resolutions and our sign-out letter for elected officials. If you have any questions that you weren't able to ask here, or you want to get in touch with a particular speaker, please follow up with Megaphone PR or email us at media@acrecampaigns.org, and our comms team will follow up with you. You can also visit acrecampaigns.org for more information. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Special thanks to our speakers and Tia and Mike for handling the back end. We'll keep you all posted about the campaign. So that's the end of our program. Take care, everyone.